This is the Qualitative Research Paper, Chapter 9, A Guide to Writing Sociology Papers. Okay, so a qualitative paper is not as structured as the quantitative. When it comes to the paper write-up, right, the qualitative approach is a bit more relaxed in the paper write-up. So in quantitative papers, you have a very structured hypothesis, and you have to talk about accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis, while in qualitative, your specific methodological approach is going to guide you instead. So qualitative often starts with a question and not as rigid a hypothesis as information is understood through the theory that gets applied to the results. So qualitative approach emphasizes sociological themes, and qualitative papers make sense of the data by using concepts and theories. So qualitative is inductive versus the deductive approach of quantitative methods, right? Inductive means that you're reasoning differently, starting with the questions, then observing, then applying generalizations or theories to the results of the observations. So you may not know what you're going to find when you use qualitative, and you apply theory to what you do find. Qualitative research is also known for providing thick descriptions, which is what I love about qualitative methods, especially with my journalism background. The idea is that these thick descriptions transform you into the social venue that's being studied. So for example, I use the ethnography Code of the Street in my criminology course that includes the lived experiences of young men and women of color in an impoverished neighborhood in Philadelphia. And in his first chapter, actually, technically it's the introduction chapter, but whatever, he takes you down Germantown Avenue. So as you walk with him, he describes the physical neighborhood. You hear the sounds, you smell the smells, you see the sights, right? Because it's so full of rich descriptions. So it connects you to the research, to the findings, and, these kind of descriptions can really have a lasting impact on us, because they're so rich and they are powerful in that they can transform us, or, transport us to this kind of other world. So the descriptions themselves are sensitive to meanings. So when using these descriptions, we need to look beyond stereotypical demographics and make sure to find ways to explore the social location or social group that we're observing. The descriptions are the data. When it comes to types of qualitative papers, there's a lot of different types, but there's a few that the book discusses. So the first is a case study. So this is an in-depth study of one person, group, or event. So nearly every aspect of a subject's life and history is analyzed in a case study in order to seek patterns and causes of behaviors. An example of a case study could be if your research question was looking at experiences of workers in the gig economy. Your case study could be drivers from Uber or maybe DoorDash as your case study for that larger issue in the gig economy. Another approach is comparative analysis. This is when you compare two different theories or schools of thought. So it's basically comparing and contrasting. This is something you did in a small way in one of the weekly writing assignments when I asked you to compare any two U.S. presidents. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that as a full study, but we don't really have to get into that. Okay, an interview study, pretty straightforward. It's when you interview participants, right? But there are different kinds of interviews. So they vary in how structured they are. With all the way at one end, you have very structured interviews that have a very specific interview schedule. You ask those questions, right? You ask the same questions of everybody. You have more in the middle, what's called semi-structured interviews, where you allow for more questions to be worked in. And this gives it a more conversational style. And there's an opportunity to ask follow-up or probing questions to kind of get people to clarify what they're talking about. And then there's all the way to the other end, unstructured, or just kind of free-form conversation interviews that's much more about themes or topics than a specific interview schedule. So you can see that even within this one methodology of interview studies, there's many ways to construct that interview and different levels of structure to each one. Also, the book discusses archival studies. So they talk about how it's sort of like the interview study format, only you're not interviewing those people directly, right? So for archival study, you can use what the book calls interview documents, such as newspapers, diaries, letters, right? Or I would add to that list like TV interviews. But more than just interviews, archival data can be all sorts of existing human documentation, like art, images, sound recordings, objects, artifacts, right? So for example, I'm a library person who's worked in libraries for over 15 years. So I have an old coworker friend of mine that's an archivist, and she gets to spend all of her time with this cool information, right? So she now works for Jim Henson Company Archives, which has got to be a pretty cool job. So when we worked together, she had just ended her internship at the Lucas Ranch, cataloging head explosions in video footage. That's a random skill for life, right? So that later someone could come along and type into the database head explosion, right? And boom, pun intended, there they are, right? It's painstaking work to catalog things, but I'm so glad archivists are out there doing this work. Because of their diligence, more info is available than ever, as they're carefully out there scanning artwork, journals, manuscripts, and other documents that were previously unavailable outside of those archives. Like, you would need special permission to view these things. More and more of these sources are now becoming available to the rest of us, and this can be an incredible source of information. So archival research studies can be quantitative, but they are more often qualitative, such as examining letters that were sent between couples during World War II, right? Something like that. But archival research could also be census records, files from a company. So again, there's so many ways to use existing archival data. And of course, last but definitely not least, there's ethnography, which is a sociological method based on direct observation of the social world, or in-depth interviews that reflect direct knowledge of a specific social setting. So for instance, the book Righteous Dope Fiend chronicles the lives of crack and heroin addicts in the Bay Area. And this research came from over a decade of following a group of users through their daily struggles and then applying sociological theory to make meanings from the patterns observed over those many years. I love ethnographies, right? This is not an objective thing. I'm very subjective. I love ethnographies. They have the power to shine light on groups that are most often left out of the larger analysis. The most subversive or the most subaltern groups are often humanized through the practice of ethnography, since the method situates the participants' stories and experiences as the data. So when it's done right, you become a fly on the wall of a social group, getting a perspective you wouldn't have had otherwise. And there are so many great ethnographies out there. Highly recommend finding some for yourself. If you'd like any recommendations from me, feel free to reach out. It makes my Venn diagram of librarian and professor a perfect circle, and I really enjoy passing these things on to you all. Okay, moving on to goals and methods. So within ethnographic field research, it's all about learning about a group or a social setting. So it can be a complement to quantitative research. So for instance, quantitative research can show the disproportionate number of people of color incarcerated in America, right? But an ethnography can give you a glimpse into the lived conditions of those people when they're in jails and prisons, or the experiences that they face, of struggle with lack of social supports once they're released from prison. So really, it can humanize those larger issues we see in the culture. Ethnographic field research is also looking at those things that most of us do not see unless we're participants in the social world or specific social settings. So it gives outsiders an insider view into groups or spaces that are often not open to them. So the data in ethnographic field research, that data comes from observing or interacting with people in everyday social settings, or the field you're examining. So you jot down notes through this process called field notes, and after many notes, right, you have that and you can start to form an analysis to reveal the unseen patterns and values that people that aren't that closely examining or, really kind of observing this group are not going to see, right? So sometimes ethnographic research also involves interviews with some of the people knowledgeable to that setting. And ethnographic research also often involves participant observation, which is when you take part in the activities in that setting. So let me give you a practical example. When I was in grad school, I took a qualitative methods course where we had to take field notes at a social location and practice developing those rich descriptions to turn into data later. So I, for some reason, decided I would go to one of my favorite social spaces, which is a dive bar inside of a dive bowling alley, to observe the people in that setting. Since the bar has nightly karaoke, I felt obliged to get up there and sing some stuff so that I'm not just that creep sitting in the corner not singing and instead stealing glances at people and writing notes. So in a lot of research, writing the notes out in public or out in the open makes you look like a weirdo, right? People don't drop their guard unless they feel like you're part of that social space. So you don't always need to participate, but it can often give you a different perspective that helps you understand the experiences and really the headspace of your research participants. And like with many things in life, ethnographic observation and analysis skills are developed through lots of practice. And I warn you, it's like an awareness you cannot turn off. My husband, who's not a sociologist, but instead has a master's in environmental science, thinks it's weird that I notice the demographics of every room we're in, right? And mostly his issue is that I can't help but eavesdrop on people sometimes. I don't mean to. And be like, oh, how interesting. And he's like, oh, I tuned that out because I'm a normal person just trying to eat my enchiladas. But I'm low-key always like, hey, look at those interactions between those parents and kids. Check out how the busboy was snubbed by the waiter. Right? It goes to my theory why so many sociologists end up with other sociologists. Because who else can stand to hear us talk about demographics? Or who wants us to ruin every movie by starting a conversation about representations of characters? I live for those conversations. But I guess I can see how others are not like really into that. They're like, no, thank you. So in my experience, once you turn on that sociological gaze, good luck turning it off. Okay, when it comes to collecting your data, just like with quantitative research, before you start collecting the data, you need to plan ahead, right? You need to develop your questions and figure out what you're looking for and hammer out all the details so you can move on to recording the data without interruption or problem. So in qualitative research, you need to be specific as to how you will record the data, how you will save that information, and how you'll make sure it's representative of the respondents' experiences. So like I mentioned before, when it comes to field notes, this is where you jot down notes in a particular scene or with a group day after day. And in ethnography, this means for years you do this, right? Then you put all those notes together and you start to make visible the patterns that would otherwise go undetected. Often when it comes to recorded interviews, these are a common way to get your data in qualitative methods. So you need to think about how would you record it? Would it be video? Would it be audio recording? Would you just take notes as they talked? Different approaches to the methods give us different ways to approach this, but most often people record the audio and transcribe it, and that transcribed document becomes the data. So the responses and the voices of the participants become the data you analyze. It's especially important in qualitative methods to produce an accurate representation of the group or social location that you're studying. Qualitative is supposed to communicate the lived experiences of participants, and if they are not accurately represented, then the research is not valid and doesn't teach us about that location or group. It's very important that this research at least the researcher themselves, use reflexivity and be thoughtful about what their impact could be on the research so that they're not prejudicing it in some way. Right? In sociology, we like to dispel social myths instead of justifying them or reifying stereotypes. So this is but a part of the ethical concerns you need to protect for, along with the confidentiality and other ethical concerns of limiting harm to your participants. This connects to the IRB. So the Institutional Review Board is what you submit your research proposal to in order to get approval to carry out your research before you start collecting the data. So they make sure you explain how you will protect your participants, specifically their identities and information, as well as providing them with informed consent so that they know they can leave the research at any time if they choose to do so. It may be a pain in the ass for us if people leave our research study, but we need to respect our participants. Their lives are our data. So we need to do our best to respect their wishes and protect them from any potential harm that our research could cause them based on their participation. An important issue to getting the ethics and representation right is carefully and thoughtfully listening to respondents, what they say, how they say it, and then look at how they act to see if the two connect. Something we talk about in my research methods course is how people often think one thing about themselves, but act another way entirely. So I've had students ask me, well, what happens if they lie to you? And I always say, well, that might happen. But if you're an adept interviewer, you can often spot the lie. And it can actually provide you with interesting information. You have to listen to them and represent them well. One of the ways I do this in my research is by using a feminist praxis where I let people read what I wrote about them and see if they feel it does not accurately represent them. And luckily, so far, that's never been an issue. But the point of doing this, is that I feel that the only reason to do the research is to actually represent the people, right? So what's the point of doing the research if I'm not representing what they think? And instead, I'm putting what I think they think on them instead. So a way to get at your respondents' views is by using open-ended questions. These allow for them to explain in their own words. So you want to use probing questions when they're being vague, because it's always best to hear from their mouth instead of filling in the blanks afterward. So you want them to explain specific details and events, instead of trying to explain for them. So asking them to elaborate or provide an example can be very illuminating. When it comes to organizing your data, you're going to look for themes and patterns. So if you're doing interviews, it takes about 7 hours for every hour-long interview to type up the recordings into transcriptions. While you're doing this long-ass process of typing up transcriptions, you start to see patterns and trends forming. So you'll also analyze by demographics and see how different groups experience those phenomena you're studying differently. So this could be age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, gender identity, disability, social class, maybe even region of the country where you live, right? Or even things like level of education or political party affiliation. So numerous demographic factors give us insight into how social phenomenon are experienced differently by different groups in the same location. So when it comes to coding your information, this is grouping your findings among the major themes that you see in the responses. So the book gets into this a little deeper, but really it's the process of finding meaning from your data that helps you, kind of like this little image down here. It helps you sort and organize your findings. Okay, so what about writing your paper? Well, approaches differ in qualitative research because it's guided by your specific methodological approach, meaning that a paper using interviews will differ from one using archival research, or one that is maybe an ethnography. So this is kind of going back to differentiating qualitative research from quantitative, because in quantitative, there's a very specific set structure for the paper write-up, but that's really not the case in qualitative. In qualitative, you're using respondents' voices as your data. So if you can use direct quotes that you have as a result of transcribing your interviews or compiling your field notes, they can be extremely important in demonstrating the perspectives and experiences of your research sample. So the breakdown of paper sections is pretty similar to the quantitative approach, right? You got your intro, your conclusion that they just ignore for some reason in the chapter, and then you have the literature review and methods. But instead of, so again, it's pretty similar, but you have a findings section instead of a results section. So instead of a bunch of tables, you have findings. And this is typically where you're going to have a bunch of quotes and things of that nature from your transcripts, or specifics from your field notes. And your discussion section differs a lot because qualitative research applies theories and concepts to the findings to create meanings, right? Because it's an inductive approach, as I talked about before, which is the opposite of quantitative, where you start with a theory and then see if you prove or disprove it. Qualitative is much more about finding out through the process and producing information that's interpretable. So, okay, remember, for this class, I just want to see that you can demonstrate the planning part of this because you're not actually doing the methods for this class. I want to see how well you can plan your hypothetical qualitative research and how well you can articulate how you would prevent ethical issues and other concerns that could come up in the research. So that's what I'm going to be looking for when I'm looking through those paper submissions.